So it is my pleasure to introduce Leslie Weldon, the Deputy Chief of the U.S. Forest Service for National Parks. The national parks are 193 million acres. I'm a Rhode Islander, and that's well over 120 Rhode Island standard units. But it's also, more importantly, almost all of our large landscapes across the country intersect in some way with the National Forest System and the wonderful people who administer that system. So we thought it fitting for Leslie to talk to us as our final keynote speaker. Leslie has a distinguished career, having come up through the ranks of the Forest Service and served at many locations across the system where many of you work. So it is my pleasure to welcome her and thank her for joining us this afternoon. Leslie?
All right, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and as I was telling Bob over today and the last couple of weeks, is that there have been several times when I wanted to join back in with this group in particular, with this network, and every other things were pulling me away. So it's nice, even if it's just for a day, well, last night and today, to be with you. I just want to start out by saying how impressed I am. I knew I would be, but just for the time that I've been here, from the voices in the room, the experiences, the knowledge, the expertise, the commitment around this whole theme of large landscapes with people has really expanded and grown from the time when I first had my engagements with it. And I don't know where, there's Sean. Sean and Matt McKinney back in the 2009, 2010 era, right when I was regional forester in Montana, came and spoke with me in my office about this idea of this practitioners network, but even beyond that, having to do with forming the roundtable for the crown of the continent. So it was really something, to be on that landscape and to be part of the group of people across this whole spectrum of conservation and people connected to land, to talk about some principles about what does it mean for us to, literally be in this together across this landscape, even though you come from so many different perspectives. And it's wonderful to see how that concept's continued to grow in strength, and that there's a group like this that continues to turn its attention into, I think, is what is going to continue to be a very strong piece of what we call conservation in this country. My beginnings were literally as a person who stepped away from my family in Washington, D.C. area. Kid grew up in the suburbs with very little outdoor experiences, but a passion around wildlife and conservation, into my first jobs with the Forest Service back in the very early 80s in Washington State. I remember it was a year after Mount St. Helens had blown up, and being in North Bend, Washington, and driving through areas that still had the huge piles of ash everywhere and that sort of thing. But my first jobs were reforestation behind harvest areas. I remember going out and doing surveys on trees planted in their first and third year to look at survival, and still be next to these massive areas where we were doing harvesting with skyline yarding and all that, kind of in the heart of those days, and just have had a really interesting arc of experiences through the last 30 plus years as far as where we are now, with this real era focused on what does it mean for us to really take up this ideal of sustainability and to have that something that is truly shared across landscapes. So as an agency called the Forest Service, that's something that has been hopefully a steady evolution with what's happened across society. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about our context for large landscape management. Hopefully it sounds very familiar to what everyone's doing, just with a handful of slides, and then talk more about what our experience has been with the transition in administration, and where does the Forest Service in service to the public find ourselves today as we have transitioned. So this map, once again, you've seen plenty of maps this week. I'm going to blow through these slides really fast. But wanted to show, the context of the national forests, which are the green lands, with all these other public lands, whether it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the red or pink, the Bureau of Land Management, the DOD lands, Park Service, so on and so forth. It doesn't have the state lands. And as you've seen in earlier presentations, there's 775 million acres of forest land in this country. Only that 193 is considered national forest, and about 550 million are private land. So our context for looking at forests in this country, can only be taken from that standpoint of the whole. And of course, in the east, the public lands piece of that has different origins, really focused on watershed preservation and restoration, and recovery of lands that had otherwise not been needed. So, the story. We're in a time where we have severe conditions. 80 plus million acres are impacted or at risk from being lost or significantly changed from insect and disease and wildfire. We're seeing actively a major adjustment in our forest systems, especially in the west, and even happening in the east in places like Texas, the southern Appalachians, and Florida, from this era where we have had ingrowth, whether from this main cause of fire suppression or from the changes that have occurred in climate that have resulted in a lot more ingrowth. Another different way of looking at the state of conservation lands in North America, just showing a quick snapshot of a mapping exercise and a project that was done by the North American Wilderness and Protected Areas Coalition, which includes our partners in Parks Canada, CONAP, which is the equivalent of our preserved areas in Mexico, and then the U.S. agencies. And this was done as a way to demonstrate how protected areas, which is a very particular definition under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, occur across North America. And so another attempt to begin looking at what are these anchor places for our most protected areas, and then how do all these other lands fit in. So that was a great project to work on across those partners. So many of you are hopefully familiar with the work that started in 2009 and 2010, where the Forest Service, through a program called the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, really moved into this era of looking at local-based collaboration for dedicated funds for landscape scale restoration that had us begin, I think, a new practice. This new practice began with a lot of support from outside groups, Nature Conservancy, Society of American Foresters, National Forest Foundation, American Forests, and a few other groups, Wilderness Society, that really wanted to be a part of us changing the way we worked from really local-based, kind of stand-based projects to where we really took into consideration what it means for us to look at restoring ecosystem function, looking at that nexus of what communities need to be successful in the natural resource economy, and looking at the long term. So these projects are predominantly based in fire-adapted ecosystems, and all needed to be developed under a collaborative frame where there was agreement with a spectrum of folks in communities with the Forest Service on the work that needed to occur over a 10-year period. So we're in our 9th year of this work, and it has shown great success in developing a practice around collaboration, and then also developing a practice that has us look at taking care of whole landscapes. So while these are our 23 collaborative forest landscape restoration sites, we have a few other projects. Some of them are done through our work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, where our two chiefs came together and said, this work should clearly link together the objectives and goals that NRCS has as it relates to assisting private landowners in sustainable management and delivering goods and services in adjacency to the national forests. So we've got these practices that we've begun. We've got these investments, and we've luckily, and I say we, it's all of us, got a real sense of what it means to identify goals and objectives together, and then kind of turn our attention into what does it take to deliver the whole suite of outcomes that we work through, whether it's taking care of our water, reducing risk of wildfire adjacent to communities, creating recreation opportunities, managing invasive species, managing for biological diversity. And so I describe this time as a time of a lot of riches, when it comes to working collaboratively on landscapes, and something that, as we've gotten to this point, there's still huge opportunities for us to go further in sharing information, sharing expertise, and aiming higher for the types of changes and outcomes that we want to see on our landscapes. I'm just going to put up a few examples of, I would say, the trip through time we've been on as it relates to taking on very large landscapes. So everyone remembers, the work and the legacy around managing the Northwest Forest Plan ecosystem. We're actually at a time now where our folks in regions 5 and 6, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, are looking at where do we go next, for applying what we've learned over the last, almost 25 plus years into our next era of management for those lands. This week there's a session going on in Missoula, Montana that has brought together a very dedicated group of people from our research and development, universities, some of our on-the-ground managers around the white bark pine ecosystem, along with the White Bark Pine Foundation and American Forest Foundation. And so many of you know this is an ecosystem that's also in peril. It was petitioned for listing, hasn't been listed, but we've been working very closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on what conservation strategies can be for this, that we can begin putting to work to really thwart that. So when you think of taking on a big challenge on a landscape to be able to sustain everything that these white bark pine ecosystems bring for us, that's a challenge that, together we're leaning in on. What's unique about this landscape within the U.S. is that about 85–90% of the white bark pine ecosystem and some of the other high elevation 5-needle pine ecosystems are on national forest land. So it's, if we don't do it, who will do that? And we're lucky that we've got a lot of support, but it'll be very challenging, especially with portions of this being within wilderness areas. Other examples that hopefully you heard about earlier this week for large landscape conservation are with our longleaf pine initiative. If you remember that map before, where very few lands, very few national forests are in public ownership, most of it in private, but a great collaboration and a great long-term commitment to restore this longleaf pine ecosystem with support from across the conservation spectrum. And then just wanted to pull this one up to highlight work that the Forest Service has been doing very closely with many, many other partners on the Southern Forest Futures project. So hopefully that's something that folks can kind of recognize. So, a bit of overview about how and where we're growing our own practice, being part of this national landscape. We're also participating in any of the LCCs that are related to national forest land as part of those partnerships. And again, a wealth of riches as it comes to expertise, information, and support and commitment. So I wanted to talk a little bit now about this transition and what has it meant for the Forest Service. We have moved from an era of 8 years under the previous administration, and I got a couple of my colleagues in here that we worked very closely with through that, into the new administration with Secretary Perdue, who's the Secretary of Agriculture, and a new chief who was named in August. I call him the Eclipse Chief because he was announced on Eclipse Day. I don't know if I've called him that to his face yet, but I'll try that out. So Tony took, and what's nice is that we've been colleagues for years. So to share some of the sense of transition there, again, my gang, the people I work with, we've been career employees in the agency, many of us serving in leadership levels, and experience a transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, happens at so many different scales. So the scale I'm going to talk about is kind of in headquarters, which is really about how we can do our best to prepare ourselves to be responsive to the needs, desires, and goals of the new administration, grow relationships, but also be the people who convey the context for the work that we have been doing, how the public has been part of that, how it's delivering services and benefits. So that whole core about what does the Forest Service do, that part doesn't change. What usually changes with the change in administration are aspects of emphasis and aspects of the frame of engagement with different parts of the population. But the mission of the Forest Service isn't changed. The way we do work hasn't changed. If I want to describe the emphasis and frame that we put in the last 8 years up to now, it's been about restoration and resiliency of landscapes. It's been about being of service to communities that are close to those resources. It's been about connecting people to nature. Underlying all of that has been our challenge around changing how we fund wildfires. Huge emphasis over the last number of years. All of those things continue, but I would describe it in a frame that's slightly different than what was before. So Secretary Perdue has all of USDA, so it's about agriculture, it's about trade, it's about rural prosperity, it's about the service and support programs like SNAP and WIC and all of those things. And it's about the national forest. I won't name off the 7 priorities that the new secretary has, but I'll name off 2 of them. One is, again, ensuring the prosperity of rural communities, and then the other is distinctly named as ensuring the health of the national forests in grasslands. And so both of those, of course, on the forest side, give us a lot of space to define what success looks like. I did want to spend a couple of moments talking about this rural prosperity part. Secretary Perdue is the individual that President Trump named to lead the rural prosperity efforts on behalf of the whole country. And so USDA has been really involved with that. Where there's opportunity there is really around this nexus of natural resources and rural communities. And I think there's a huge opportunity for that to be expanded and grown more as far as what the opportunities are if we focus on strategic goals in the right way and perhaps even focus resources on this continuing goal for us improving forest conditions. So our language before was around restoration and resiliency of forests. Now it's improving forest conditions. If you look at the next lines down under that, it's all the same of what was before. The outcomes we want to get is to make sure while we're increasing the amount of fuels reduction, the amount of reducing forest density, which are the key things that reduce risk adjacent to communities and put us in a place where our forests can be more healthy and vibrant and where our watersheds can be more healthy. We've been asked to make sure that we are doing that in a way that maximizes opportunities for jobs within communities, which is that connection that is really important. We always are asked to find ways to do more with what we have. And we know that that doesn't happen in any magical way. What I'll say is that with Chief Took coming in, he has expressed a willingness to take on some really big changes within the agency that can free up and enable us, within our own process, bureaucracy and those sorts of things, to enable us to be able to get more done because we're working more efficiently with the resources that we have. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The other piece about rural economy has to do with something I wanted to bring up as an opportunity for connection with this community, and that has to do with the outdoor economy. If we're looking for a place to build support for the value and importance of any kind of conservation, let alone large landscape conservation. There's a bit of an emphasis that's growing around the impact and strength of outdoor economy. Some of you last year may have seen that there was a Recreation Act passed, and that act required that there be work done by the Bureau of Economic Analysis to evaluate how the outdoor industry can be considered as part of, sort of a keystone of the gross domestic product in the U.S. So over the last couple of years, you may have heard from Outdoor Industry Association about the rec economy, all put together being of about $900 billion within this country. And much of that happening in the context of the backdrop of where outdoor rec occurs, which is on public lands and such. So if you have this industry, whether it's defined by an REI or by the National RV Association or Bass Pro Shops and all the small businesses that make gear and such, the ski areas, all of those entities serve people who somehow have a connection with lands. And people grow in a sense of value around the outdoors, usually because they have an experience with that. So as we look to the future, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to take this kind of conversation and ask those questions with that other group. And then how can together there be a voice and some weight behind why it's necessary for us to continue to invest and to take care of all of these lands. And I think it would be an interesting conversation to have a bit of a mashup between how those groups get together and how this group get together and say, hey, we both rely on and are trying to care for and depend on healthy lands and healthy landscapes. So just a few more things, and I do want to open it up for a bit of questions. So I'm going to describe, and this is representing a public service agency where your tax dollars pay for the work that happens across the Forest Service. I wanted to ask your indulgence in hearing a bit about what our new chief says is critically important for the Forest Service to focus on in this coming time. Some of it, of course, is really laid in with the natural resources part, but part of it's with organization. So I just wanted to share a bit of an overview of those things with you, and then get to where we can get to some questions. So I will start by saying once again that we are extremely fortunate that Secretary Perdue has appointed Tony Took as Chief of the Forest Service. And I know some of you in various ways have had experiences with him, whether during his time in a national office where he was our Director of Ecosystem Management and Planning and was the person behind the Forest Service's success with our 2012 planning rule, or as the Regional Forester in the Southeast U.S. He's a person that has deep, bone-deep commitment to conservation and public service. It comes from his earliest days and how he grew up. He's also a person who is absolutely committed to relationships first as a way that we get anything done. He's demonstrated that through all of the ways that he's worked, and coming in as chief, he's been chief since August, and the amount of impact I think he has around relationships, creating a good way and place for our employees to thrive is something that, with just that short period of time has been felt really deeply in the agency. He has identified for the Forest Service 5 places that he wants to see us in this next few years really show up in a way that demonstrates that we're making the right kind of change. We're letting go of some things. We're shifting. We're taking on new skills to perform better, because he believes that the future success of the Forest Service, and again as an anchor in a broader landscape, is really dependent on these things. So the first is really around our employees. He wants to make sure that we are providing leadership and enabling our employees to be uplifted and empowered through safe, respectful work environment. So the key words there are safe and respectful, which really has to do with making sure that every single person that we engage with and that is within our agency is there to do their best work. They're free from harassment. They're free from the kind of burdens that a bureaucracy puts on people that when we really stand back don't really need to be there. So within that is a real sense of the leadership that I and others provide, put our employees in the best place to do their best work. Another is really around being good neighbor and excellent customer service. I'll talk a little bit about the good neighbor part. When this gets back to that whole thing about relationships being first, and we have heard so much across the whole system how valuable that relationship is because it's based on trust, and that doesn't happen quickly. Our employees, our leaders, need to make sure that they understand, with whatever community that we're in, that having that trusting relationship is something that is a form of currency, to be able to work well with others, to get work done, and to be successful. But we don't always have that as a skill or an expectation for people who are stepping into those leadership roles. We're going to keep having the turnover, like we said, but that doesn't have to mean that when a person leaves a community that the community feels like it's totally uncertain on whether it's like a whole new ball game, for a new man or woman coming into those leadership roles, because it's the Forest Service that's making the commitments, not the individual. So, just harping on that sense of us, whether we work in a way that is relational and really about delivering outcomes for the long term, or if we're transactional. And I know that many of you in the room, can relate to experiences on which of those works better as far as relationships. So how are we truly improving our ability to be of service to citizens in a way that enables us to deliver the whole suite of mission outcomes? Another one is around sharing stewardship. And again, our work here is a great example of that. By expanding the way that we're able to work in partnership with others, volunteerism, and through service programs. So again, that arc of connecting people to nature and really making sure as we deliver our conservation work and outcomes, we do it with and through others, and that we have that as something that isn't in the nice to do category because one leader or one program manager enjoys doing that versus others who don't. It's an imperative. That's the way that we will be successful in the future. So lots of things that we need to grow into, change and shift how we design our organization to enable more of the skills and abilities that are within your communities to help us to take care of these lands. And the next one is really around improving the conditions of forests and grasslands. I won't go over again, what we feel is important around what does it mean for us to have resilient watersheds, resilient forests, diverse and abundant habitat in water and those sorts of things. One of the key emphasis within that is around how the Forest Service uses NEPA, basically, environmental analysis and decision making in the Forest Service. We have, through the years, become the federal agency that takes the most time, invests the most people, time, and money, so on and so forth, through our NEPA, whether it's in a categorical exclusion, a environmental analysis, or an environmental impact statement. We have found that we're the agency that does the most, yet when we look at what gets delivered under any one decision, we're not optimizing the return on investment. That's something that is that has captured a lot of the energy within the agency around how we get decisions out, that is out of balance, to the point where we've got a initiative that we've launched to literally turn that around so that we can stay focused on what it means for us to do good conservation work through using NEPA that significantly increases the amount of work that we're able to get done. An example of that is with the work that we piloted with the initiative, Forest Restoration Initiative in the Southeast. We, under one analysis, were able to take in a landscape that was about 1 million acres, and from there we're able to identify close to 500,000 acres that needed forest restoration work, either through prescribed burning or through forest thinning, and did that with a large group of citizens. We used our process to get the decision made, had an objections process following that, where folks who disagreed with aspects or wanted clarity were able to work through us. And then we were able to implement that project. The biggest success around that with us being part of a collaborative is that there were no lawsuits on that. So we're at a place where we are implementing through one decision over or close to 500 million acres of work that'll happen over the next number of years. I don't know if everywhere is possible to do that size of project, but if we did, a fraction of that in many other places with that kind of support with our decision making, then being able to accelerate how we're improving those forest conditions and getting that resiliency back on there will change. And so I ask you to keep your eyes and ears open as you're working with the Forest Service locally about what is shifting and changing there. If there's something from an internal standpoint that really can enable us to deliver better on our work for restoring and caring for these ecosystems, for getting these forests back on track and reducing risk adjacent to communities, it's going to be around the reforms that we're setting up for NEPA. There'll be more we'll share on that as we identify some specific goals, in the next year or so and over the next 5 years. But that's one of those things where we definitely need to turn things over to be able to do work. And then this last area is really around this focus on recreation opportunity, improving access, and sustaining infrastructure. So think of roads, think of trails, think of the facilities out there, the work that we do that enable businesses, states, and others to develop transportation, communication, energy, minerals, and those sorts of things. But my emphasis that I want to share within is, once again, is around the fact that most Americans experience the national forest because they want to have fun on it. They come out to experience it by enjoying some kind of recreation activity. In that place where we're able to make that contact and create a person who cares about conservation and stewardship. So I was really pleased that the new chief put that in the center as a way for us to continue growing in our ability to connect people to nature, but also to highlight the value and importance of the role of recreation in the work that the Forest Service does. So those are the themes of focus. We're right now at our place, being at the beginning of the fiscal year, of putting all of our metrics and objectives together around those, and actually have a call in about an hour or so with our national leadership team to talk about how that's going to be framed up even further. So all of those relate to our ability to continue to grow our skill set around large landscape conservation. We have some exciting things coming up over the next year. Next year is the 50th anniversary of both the National Trails Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Basically two forms of what I call kind of linear landscapes and things that connect people across landscapes. That's going to give us a really excellent opportunity to talk about, what it means to people, what it means to these systems, and how we can focus on those well into the future. To close and see if we have time for a bit of questions, I again want to emphasize this opportunity with this secretary around rural prosperity. Right now, more of the kind of broadband developing access for further economic development has been a bit of the focus, but I think there's a huge opportunity for us to be talking a lot more about that nexus of natural resource-based communities and opportunities that can grow from there. And then the other thing around growing the support for conservation of any kind but especially large landscape conservation, by really looking at how we can change the dialogue and grow into some interesting conversations with the folks that are looking for support around the whole outdoor economy side of things. So I want to close by just, again, saying how thankful and impressed I am around the work that all of you are doing. We look at big maps and big data and pretty audacious goals and outcomes and objectives, but to get them done, it really boils down to the nature of the person-to-person relationships and the willingness to engage and share with each other to deliver those results. So I just want to thank you for that. You're a force of nature. I've been really glad to see how this practice and this idea around large landscape conservation has continued to evolve and grow, and I think it is in good stead to continue to have a strong influence on the success of conservation in this country and in other countries. So thank you very much.